Repression, like suppression and like evasion, is an avoidance reaction, something that we avoid being aware of, something that we avoid being in contact with. It's unlike suppression or evasion in that in order to qualify for repression, it has to be a process taking place on a subconscious level. It cannot be a conscious, one-time decision. So when I speak of repression, I think in terms of an avoidance reaction that is automatized, an automatized avoidance reaction in contrast to a conscious volitional avoidance reaction. Now, what would be a simple example? Well, to begin with, what can be repressed? Memories can be repressed, ideas can be repressed, feelings can be repressed. In a word, anything which has the potential of awareness has the potential of repression. Nietzsche says somewhere, I did that, said memory. I couldn't have, says pride, and in the end memory yielded. Now, let's take a fairly simple and classic example of how repression can begin. It's kind of a cliche, I guess, in my writing and my lectures, and because it's so simple and universal and everybody seems to understand it. A little boy is told that when he's hurt he shouldn't cry. Men don't cry, and he's taught to associate lack of masculinity, lack of manhood, therefore a lack of virtue, with crying. So the first step is that he suppresses crying. How does he do that? Well, when you cry, there's movement in the muscles around the eyes, there's muscles here under the jaw, there's various muscles that are activated. So when you tell a person to stop crying, and he stops crying, do you ever ask yourself how he does it? Very few people can tell you how to stop crying, but they can do it. If you're crying, and I told you if you don't stop crying, I'm going to put a bullet to your head in 30 seconds, you stop crying. But probably you couldn't tell me what you did. Would you agree with that? You'd stop crying. Now, this is the interesting thing, is that there's a whole interesting study there, is how early in life children learn how to control awareness and feelings, awareness and expression of feelings through regulation of breathing and through tensing up various groups of muscles. This is learned incredibly early by children, and it would be a very interesting study to learn how it is learned. But you can see children at very early ages stopping to cry, they hold their breath, they clench their fists, they squint up their faces, and the tears stop. See, one of the great contributions of Wilhelm Reich was to take this concept of repression, which had been described and written about only in a psychological level, and show what happened physically, to show that emotional repression was mediated through physical processes. It had to do with curtailing of natural breathing and with the contraction, until it became a chronic contraction, of various types of muscles. So, going back now to the young child, let's follow him through very briefly what the steps are. Okay, in the beginning, if he's hurt, he cries. That's the normal, natural animal reaction. Then he begins to get the message that he shouldn't cry, and that it's unmanly, and it won't get approval. So not crying becomes linked with his sense of personal worth. That connection is clear, right? Now, so the first thing is, when he's hurt, he tries to block the outward expression of the hurt. But he still knows that he's hurt. And he doesn't tell himself, it's perfectly okay to feel hurt and to feel great pain. It's only undesirable if I weep and cry. The connection that he makes is feeling hurt, which is intimately tied with crying, is weak, unmanly, lowers my self-worth. So he has to do two things. He has to block the physical expression of the hurt, and he has to tell himself, I'm not hurt, I don't care anyway. So he has to deny a feeling on a psychological level, and he has to block an expression on a physical level. Now, at first he has to keep doing this with each new hurt. But what happens is that the process becomes automatized, and he loses the ability readily to know when he is hurt, and he now, maybe 15 years later, 10 years later, can't cry if he wants to. He has certain of his muscles in chronic contraction. He has instituted blocks so solidly that it's no longer saying, okay, now I change my mind, I got a new philosophy of life, I'm going to cry. He may have to go through some heavy experiences or heavy therapy to regain the ability to make good contact with his hurt and to express the crying. So now we have an automatic avoidance reaction. This is what I mean by repression. When it is automatized, no longer directly subject to volitional control. Now, going back to this little boy again, To me, it would be completely unreasonable to say, for blocking crying and losing contact with the fact that he's hurt, he is morally condemnable. Because if you look at the situation in which he finds himself and the context in which he is behaving, him learning to block the expression of the tears and to make himself unaware of his own hurt can be experienced by him as completely necessary, desirable, and, quote, reasonable, unquote. Which doesn't change the fact that it's a kind of repression which, as I discussed in the disowned self, can lead him to no end of trouble psychologically later on.